this webinar, as you can see on the screen, is 8 questions that derail AGMs and how to handle them. So as many of you in the audience know, we are Condonexus. We've had the privilege of being in thousands of AGMs, of virtual AGMs. And through this experience, we've seen the good and the bad in AGMs. And while I'd say the vast majority of our AGMs go off without a hitch, and most of them last around 60 minutes or less, there are some that sort of go a bit over time. And it's through those experiences that we've seen reasons for why sometimes they may go sort of off the rails. And because of that, we wanted to hold a webinar to go through best practices at AGMs to help managers efficiently navigate these AGMs. So this is a CPR eligible activity. So property managers, general licensees that are in attendance are eligible for 1.0 CPE credits. And by tomorrow morning, we will, and hopefully sooner than that, we will be sending out a certificate of completion to anyone who is in attendance. So without further ado, I will introduce our esteemed panelists, and we'll start with the first name I see on my window there. So that's Brad Chaplick, who comes from Levitt, Lella, Duggan, and Chaplick. He serves as the team leader of LDDC Law's condo law practice group. And for many of those who are in attendance, you may have even seen him as a chairperson for your own AGM, since he does act as chairperson for condominium meetings. He also provides advice and a lot of written opinions that you may have seen in some national or provincial publications. The second panelist I see on my list is Tania Haluk. So many might be familiar with Tania. She is a vice president at Wilson Blanchard Management. She was formerly the president of CCI Toronto. And you may have seen her as a speaker at many condo events at the CCI or at ACMO or at various other seminars. So a very familiar and experienced condominium professional. And last but not least, we have Amy Riddell from INaMINUTE. So she is the founder of INaMINUTE, which happens to be one of the largest minute-taking companies in Ontario. So they do service hundreds of condos across Ontario. And whenever we see them in an AGM, we are delighted because of their professionalism, their punctuality. They're fantastic. Yes. Thanks, Amy. So with that, I will actually pass over to Brad Chaplick, who will be chairing the meeting this evening. This afternoon, I should say.
Anthony, thank you very much for the introduction. You went into autopilot there with the chairing the meeting this evening. I've done the same thing with an afternoon AGM that I had to do the other week. Okay, so thank you all for attending. We've got a big group and lots to cover, so we'll get started very quickly here. But before we jump into the list of questions, and because we have managers in attendance who are earning an hour of their continuing professional education credits for attending today's webinar, I'd just like to briefly, if we can, review some of the references in the Condominium Act that are applicable to the conduct of an annual general meeting. So there's much written about how to give notice of a meeting and all of the things that lead up to a condominium meeting in the Condominium Act. But surprisingly, the legislation says very little about what we're supposed to do once the meeting actually starts. And so there are a few precious references that we get in the Condominium Act, and I'm just going to review them for you now. There are 4 sections that I will bring to everyone's attention, and this is basically all we have in terms of legislation about what happens in a condominium's annual general meeting. So the first piece is 45 sub 3 of the Condominium Act. And this says, at an annual general meeting, an owner may raise for discussion any matter relevant to the affairs and business of the corporation. So this manifests itself as other business. So if you're wondering why is it that at every annual general meeting, there's an other business section at the end, who said that we're supposed to have other business? Why does this happen? The reason is because the Condominium Act actually requires it. And so this has become the practice of every annual general meeting that I've ever been to and that probably all of you have ever been to. And that's why. Then another one is section, now it's 47 sub 8. And it says that no vote shall be taken at a meeting of owners on any matter other than routine procedure unless that matter was clearly disclosed in the notice of meeting. So this is why we can't just suddenly decide to vote based on someone raising it in the middle of a meeting to do something like, add more directors or change the director qualifications. It has to be in the notice of meeting. It has to be done properly. You can't add things to the agenda last minute, and that's why. The third one is a new section, section 45 sub 8, which says that, I'm going to paraphrase this section because the wording is a little arcane, but basically if you're having a virtual meeting of owners, then it must enable all persons entitled to attend to reasonably participate. So reasonable participation has been interpreted by the Condominium Authority of Ontario to basically mean that they can see and hear at all times, and where entitled to vote, they are enabled, they are able to do so. That's what reasonable participation means. So that is specific to virtual meetings. I guess it's presumed that if you're attending an in-person meeting, you would be able to reasonably participate. And lastly, we have section 70 sub 6, which requires the auditor to answer questions from the owners. It says at a meeting of owners, the auditor, if present, shall answer inquiries concerning the basis upon which the auditor formed the opinion stated in the auditor's reports. So that's it. That's all we have in the Condo Act about what happens at a condo meeting. There has to be other business. Owners in attendance at virtual meetings get to reasonably participate. You can't vote on something unless it's in the notice. And yeah, the auditor is required to answer questions. So what derails our AGMs? And we've compiled a list of 8 questions. And if we've got time, there might be a couple bonus questions. And at the end of this webinar, we're going to see if you guys have any questions for us. So the first question on our list here, if we go back one slide, I think, is and I'm told that these symbols are called growlings. Is that right, Anthony?
That's right. That's a term to describe these characters that
Yes.
denote a swear word.
Yes, to denote an angry word. So how do we deal with general anger or contempt at our meetings? This can obviously derail our meetings, and to help us address these kind of problems, we'll give the floor to Tania. So,
Thanks, Brad. So first of all, we know, especially knowing there's so many managers on here, that despite Brad's introduction of what an AGM actually is, some people think this is their stage for outbursts or their platform to say whatever it is they've been holding since the last AGM. So we do understand that people get frustrated. However, we also make it clear when we're chairing, or we ask the chairperson to make it clear at the beginning of the meeting that there will be zero tolerance for abuse towards management, the board, or other owners. So I would say, and I know I'm probably preaching to the converted here, is if people can't behave themselves or control themselves at an AGM, that's not the place for them to attend. And probably condo living, I'd argue, is probably not for them either. However, that being said, the AGM's not the only place that people have an opportunity to address things to the board. And I feel like sometimes people come to the AGM not understanding that the board can be reached throughout the year, either through property management. Sometimes boards have community portals. Sometimes they have their own email addresses that people can pose questions or make recommendations or make inquiries to. And to Brad's point, if there's a misunderstanding of what can be voted for, that increases frustration too at the AGM, where people think, oh, this is my time to ask a question or put a motion forward that I could change my condo world at that meeting. And I'd argue that that's not the place for it either. It's really hard to control outbursts. That's why we like the lawyers to chair meetings whenever possible. The authoritarian stance usually works well for the outbursts. Being online these past few years, I mean, we pivoted pretty quickly to get onto these Zoom platforms and have virtual meetings, which gives us the mute button and the extraction button from meetings, but we can't do that in real life, right? So we ask people to be on their best behavior. And lastly, I would remind everyone that board members are volunteers. They're doing this for free for the best intention and the best interest of the community. We recognize that people get frustrated sometimes with their decisions, but having the outburst is not in the best interest. The board is tasked with enforcing and governance of the condo documents. They make all the decisions as elected by the owners. They have a passion to be fiscally responsible to the community. So coming in hot like that is a distraction for everyone, and for the people who want to be there for the right intentions, to hear the information, to use the democratic process to make their votes for the limited things that owners have votes for. So I think it's important, if you think you're walking into a hostile meeting, or there's certain people, to make it clear that they will be requested to leave the meeting if their behavior is not in with positive intent, I'll say.
Thank you, Tanya. And I'll just sort of add to that point about dealing with disorderly types of questions or interruptions. There is a case, YRCC 818 versus Przewski. I can send their citation to anyone if they're really interested in reading case law. I know this case very well. It was a case that I acted on as counsel and lost, sadly for me. But in the course of that case, the court made some comments about the role of a chairperson in a meeting. That case was about trying to correct results of an election, but in so doing, the chair spoke generally about what is the role of a chairperson. And the role of a chairperson is to enforce the rules of order. And that includes doing things like instructing scrutineers and deciding validity of votes, validity of ballots and proxies, examining them and deciding the results. And once those results are announced by the chairperson, they're final and binding unless reversed by the court. But enforcing the rules of order also includes making sure that people are only speaking when it's their turn to speak, that their comments are on point, that they're not derailing the discussion, and also civility. So I would say those are the big three when you're talking about rules of order and the role of the chairperson. That you speak when you have the floor, you've been recognized by the chairperson. Your comments have to be on topic as to what is the subject matter of the agenda, and that you have to be civil and courteous in your dealings with the meeting. And sometimes if it's owners being arguing with each other, crosstalk, what I'll suggest is that all the comments be addressed to the chairperson, if that's me. And I'll say, don't address your comments to each other. Don't argue with each other. You have something to say, you say it to me, you address the meeting, you address the chair. And then if you disagree, you address me, the chair, and that will bring down the temperature quite often. So that's our first question about derailing meetings. And our second question, why are the maintenance fees so high? So for that one, let's go to our Condonexus expert, but our host director, Anthony.
Thanks, Brad. That's a question that we see at our AGMs really frequently, like, the owners getting angry about the increase in condo fees, and it has become a very sensitive topic in recent years. And it's become especially sensitive because, as we all know, the cost of owning a condo has increased dramatically over the past 3 years. So some of you might know this, but some of you might not. It currently, for an average condo owner, they have to put 50% of their average household income towards mortgage, property taxes, and utilities. So that's half of their pre-tax income towards those things. So the cost of owning a condo is a lot higher than it used to be. And that's huge because the cost of owning a condo used to trend more closely to around 30% of their pre-tax household income over the past 30 years. So I think it's more important than ever before that property managers communicate to owners about how, it's important for property managers that they value managing the assets for their owners, and that they don't take that job lightly. And I feel like once you're able to demonstrate that you care about managing their finances, then you can start to explain why condo fees are actually increasing. And condo fees are really just condo costs, and condo costs have really increased a lot over the past 3 years. And condo costs happen to be beholden to inflationary pressures that go beyond those that we sort of experience as consumers. So, for example, as you all know, insurance has gone up in price by about 10% every year over the past several years. Gas rates spiked by about 50% over the past 2 years. And the cost of building construction has increased by about 50% in aggregate over the past 3 years. So the cost for operating a condo has massively increased. But on top of that, you do have the data, you do have the budget in front of you, and you can even telescope into the budget and speak to exactly what is causing the increases in the costs in your building specifically. And one thing I recommend, and it's because humans are not great at analyzing data or even understanding data. So one thing I recommend is try to limit your explanation to just 3 components in the budget that you feel that are contributing the most to condo fee increases. Don't try to list out 10. Try to just list out 3. And this hopefully just through demonstrating empathy and understanding that condo owners are going through challenging times, by explaining on a high level that costs are increasing at an elevated level in condo world, and by providing like actual examples of what's increasing condo fees in your condo. Hopefully the condo owner will be better able to understand why maintenance fees are quote unquote so high.
All right, thank you, Anthony. Tania, did you want to add to that?
Sure. We hear this a lot getting asked to the auditor at AGMs, which is not the place for that, because the auditor is reporting on the last fiscal year, not the current, or asking the auditor's opinion on, is this a good budget? And again, not what the auditor's there for. So a couple of things to add on to what Anthony was saying is there's a misconception of what condo living is. It is luxury living. And the wiggle room or discretionary spending that a board may have is very small when you look at all the fixed costs. So what we have found is sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. And instead of just having a lengthy descriptive letter with a bunch of numbers showing the budget, comparisons to last year or what have you, I agree. Just keeping a few details of where the costs went up, besides just saying a blanket answer of inflation or what have you. A pie chart is also, we find, helpful, because people can see, here's your fixed contracts, here's your reserve fund contribution, here's all the administrative costs, and then you'll see generally your R&M or your discretionary spending is maybe 2%. Everything else is built in, and it costs what it costs to run a condo. And what we hear at AGMs a lot is, oh, my friend across the street pays way less. We're the highest in the neighborhood. And that's a very inflaming blanket statement to make when you have no facts to base it. Your condo budget has facts behind it, and it's based on historical data, and it's based on future projections. And even when you're comparing 2 condos on paper that look exactly the same, no 2 condos are exactly the same. There's all kinds of differences with respect to legacy decisions a previous board may have made. Is your contribution to your reserve fund accurate or not? Do you have huge legal costs? Because we're finding Canadians are becoming more and more litigious. And normally, historically, when I was a building manager back in the day and preparing a budget, it didn't occur to me to call the lawyer to say, what should we budget for legal next year? Because things are just getting out of control, where we budgeted, you know, a couple $1,000s for some nuisance letters and place some liens, et cetera. But now we're looking at tens of thousands in some. So the litigious behavior we're seeing from people, even cost of CAT, which this is not about, a whole different subject, but it does impact the budget, because that's some unanticipated costs that you sort of have to know your neighborhood and be able to cover that. And then service levels. So whether you have a lot of amenities and pools, those are expensive to run. So when you're comparing to neighbors, it's never really apples to apples. They may have 8 hours of concierge and you have 24 hours of concierge. So all of these things present significant discrepancies. And again, it's not the AGM to discuss that. People get confused because the auditor is presenting an annual report, but keep in mind, this is an annual report from 6 months ago, because you're having your AGM within 6 months of the end of the last fiscal year. So it is always alarming. We know people have financial insecurity. Some people had suffered greatly during COVID, but we're seeing the impacts now of some bad decisions that might have made with good intentions, trying to keep fees low, and then it's going to be pay more later, as opposed to incremental increases that would have smoothed that process and the cost impact to everyone. And then lastly, I'm going to go back to a final comment. Like I said in the first question, is the board members pay the same fees as everybody else. And I think owners that get angry with the budget forget that they're trying to be as fiscally responsible as they can be. And they also have to pay these same fees if they're owners, that everybody else does. But the difference is they've got the background knowledge and have gone through the working papers of the draft. So I would say, in order to get ahead of those costs, when you know this might be something at an AGM, is come with some simple graphics to explain, because you don't want to not address this, but it's really not a topic of an AGM, which is why it gets derailed when asked.
All right, thank you, Tania. Okay, so question number 3, which we'll touch on here, is why are we meeting virtually? We want an in-person or a hybrid meeting. So this is a pretty hot topic right now, is, you know, to what extent are people still expecting virtual meetings, hybrid meetings, in-person meetings, and thinking about the reasons why we started doing virtual meetings in the first place. So, Amy, you can tackle this one.
I will. Good morning, everyone. So we actually did a deep dive into 2023 and looking at duration of meetings, because we receive a lot of questions as well from property managers asking about virtual versus in-person, pros, cons. So in 2023, out of 5,300 meetings that INaMINUTE completed, board meetings, I know we're talking AGMs, but I'm going to just quickly speak to both. Board meetings that were held virtually were 18.1% shorter than an in-person board meeting that we did in 2023. AGMs were 27.8% shorter when held virtually. So if you're looking at costs, for example, INaMINUTE bills by time. So you're paying less for a virtual meeting. You have more options for people to attend. People are away on holidays, are snowbirds, that sort of thing. Your ability to attain quorum is higher with virtual, which again will save costs. If you don't have quorum, then you have to go through that entire process again. of doing a second AGM. And we see that a lot more when an in-person meeting, an in-person AGM is being held with quorum not being attained. It's easier for your, not just INaMINUTE, but any provider that you may be using for your recording secretary services. It is much easier to have someone attend to take the minutes virtually. Pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, we were all in person. And personally, I had to find someone that was reasonably close in proximity to that site. I'm not going to have a recording secretary in Oakville that's willing to drive to Oshawa to do an in-person AGM. Virtually doesn't matter. So we have teams out in Ottawa that are able to help. So we still get, oh my goodness, we forgot to book our recording secretary and we have an AGM tonight. Virtually, most of the time we can assist you with that. Don't ever do that, please, but we can assist you with that. It's easier to shut down, as we were talking, going back to question number 1, the disruptive owners. Whenever we're attending our board meetings, our pre-AGM meetings where they're discussing and planning out the AGM, there's usually 1 or 2 owners that the board is very leery and hesitant about having at the AGM. In person, it's much more difficult to shut those people down. With virtual world, we have the mute button. So that keeps a little more order to your meeting if you have that meeting held virtually. I spoke to the cost effectiveness as well, not only in terms of time and duration of the meeting, but most companies are charging a premium now for an in-person recording secretary. I know the auditors are charging a very hefty premium to attend in person, with good reason, because virtually they can attend. They're usually there for 10 or 15 minutes. And if they're required to be there in person, well, that's likely the only AGM they're doing that night. So now they can do multiple. And then if you are doing that in-person AGM, we've got cost, we've got duration, we've got flow of meeting, avoiding disruption. You are also then usually purchasing beverages and food, and it's a bit of a social time afterwards, which adds to those costs. So we are pro virtual AGMs. Hybrid meeting, I'll just briefly speak to. We have not attended to date a hybrid AGM. We do many hybrid board meetings, which is very, very different. They're much easier. It's a smaller group. So maybe one of the other panelists can speak to the hybrid AGM format.
All right,
Yeah.
Anthony.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to the hybrid format since we do happen to provide the hybrid service. We've been holding hybrid meetings since 2020. We bring a team on site, we set up equipment, and obviously it's a service where we generate revenue. And here's the interesting, so despite generating revenue from hybrid services, we don't necessarily recommend it to condos. We ask that condos be very selective about holding a hybrid meeting, because at the end of the day, it ends up being a lot more expensive than either a virtual or an in-person meeting. It requires a lot more time and coordination, so that that time could be better spent by a manager managing a condo. And oftentimes, depending on who the chairperson is, if you don't have a Brad as a chairperson, either the in-person or the virtual crowd could potentially feel left out. So that's been our company line since we began. You can check the receipts on LinkedIn. I've been posting about that. At the end of the day, we want to provide solutions that make sense for condos. So we always ask that condos be very selective about hybrid meetings. And I think there was a question, interestingly, from Letitia Singh, who wrote, can the virtual meeting stats being discussed be shared at the meeting, or sorry, after the meeting? I do have one interesting stat to share with people here, because after our virtual AGMs, we've done thousands, we do put out a survey to all the participants. And one of the questions is, do you prefer in-person or virtual? And the trend over time is very interesting. So in 2022, about 65% of respondents on average said they prefer virtual. And then last year in 2023, that average grew to 70%. And so for a year to date in 2024, that average is at 75%. So it does seem like there's potentially a growing preference towards virtual. And we certainly see that there's certainly a comfort towards it, because we get a lot less questions about how do I attend, or I'm having microphone issues. So it does seem like a very legitimate channel for holding an AGM. And as Amy mentioned, it is just so much more accessible. If you're a mother or a parent at home who has children, you might not be able to attend. If you're on vacation, you might be unable to attend. And if there's someone with a disability, they might have a challenging time attending an in-person meeting. So a virtual meeting just usually ends up being a lot more accessible, but obviously it's on a case-by-case basis. Some condos might, at the end of the day, still prefer to do in person, and I think a manager will have a sense of whether or not that's the case.
Thank you, Anthony.
Anthony, too, just if I may speak, sorry, Brad.
Oh, go ahead, Amy.
Regarding the stats that I just indicated, INaMINUTE is going to be sending their spring newsletter out, and we are speaking to point number 3 with those stats. So anyone who is an INaMINUTE client, that will be sent out next week. So that'll be in writing. You can share with your board.
Thank you so much. And just to put a pin on this issue, we actually got a question from Ada. What's a hybrid meeting? That's a great question, Ada. That's a term that could describe a couple different things. To my mind, a hybrid meeting is a meeting where the panelists, the board, and the chairperson are in person. There are owners attending in person, and then there is a video link for owners to also participate virtually. That's what a hybrid meeting should typically look like. There are different ways to do it, but that's what it means to me. So, all right. Question number 4, we've got to get rolling here. Why isn't management taking care of, and then whatever the maintenance issue of the day is? So for this, we go back to Tania.
Thanks, Brad. I'll make it short and recover some time. So 2 things happen here. People will take the platform at the AGM to air their own personal grievances of what's happening in their suite. And again, that's not the place of the AGM. And hopefully the chairperson or property manager would interject that that should be discussed offline, and we'll talk to them the next business day about whatever their grievances or maintenance requirement. There's also the distinction of something that's not actually a corporation responsibility, something that a homeowner should be taking up on their own, and again, offline commentary. So from the property management perspective, we take direction from the board, and anything that's out of our discretionary spending limits, we need approvals for. So sometimes things take longer than everyone would like, but that's part of the process for due diligence to make sure the board's being fiscally responsible. And we're at the mercy, the corporation and the managers are at the mercy of the trades. We know there's labor shortages. We prefer to deal with vendors that are familiar with the building, so you're not wasting time and money, resources, having retraining new contractors on site when things need to be done. I'd say communication is the key here when you have major projects that are suffering delays, and they could be weather related, labor shortage related, someone's sick, who knows what happens. However, the communication is key in explaining things to people, because when left to their own devices, they're going to fill in their blanks, and that's why they come to the annual general meeting angry. I don't know any manager that wakes up in the morning saying, how can I make my life more difficult and more stressful by not taking care of maintenance issues? So we try our best to take care of these things. Our lives would be less stressed if everything got fixed just like the Amazon Prime same day delivery, but that's not the reality of the world. So I would say communication would be the key here, and trying to diffuse the situation by getting ahead of it and not waiting for an AGM for these things to come up.
Thank you, Tanya. And I'll just add to that response, just as you said, in responding to a question of that nature, you're going to distinguish between something that falls specific to that owner's unit, which you're going to take offline, versus a common issue, which would be discussed in other business. So again, from the perspective of the chairperson, from the perspective of rules of order that the chairperson must enforce, we want to ensure that the question, when it's raised, falls within the current agenda topic. So that means other business for most meetings, unless you have on your agenda as a specific item for discussion, garage repairs or whatever the maintenance issue might be. So that's the meeting perspective, the technical side of that question that you want to keep in mind before you jump into a long answer and then find yourself 45 minutes deep into a discussion when you're supposed to be approving the minutes. All right. So if we can jump ahead a couple slides here to question number 5, we get to the question, can we install security cameras, hire additional security? Security is a big issue now, safety in condominiums. These questions come up frequently, and helping us answer that is going to be Anthony.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, safety is definitely a question that comes up relatively frequently at condo AGMs, and it's another one of those really sensitive topics. And it's one of those topics where if you're not careful in how you answer, it can really lead to a cascade of other owners piling on and asking about more safety issues. We've seen that happen so many times. So because it is a sensitive issue, firstly, I think it's really important to work to understand that owner's perspective. Really try to understand, how they feel unsafe, why, where, what makes them feel unsafe. Is it parcels getting stolen? Is it people following them into the lobby? Is it, something about the parking lots or the locker rooms? Really hone in on what it is. And I think, once you show that you're actively listening and not just simply brushing off their concerns, then that hopefully removes the need for other owners to come in and continue repeating the question or trying to nail that point. And it's also at that point where you can start to share that you can explore options to make people feel more safe. And obviously at a meeting, you can't decide on anything. That happens at a board meeting where there's a resolution of the board. So it's important to say you can't decide at the meeting, but there are options, and you might feel the liberty to say some of those options, like maybe it's video cameras, or maybe it's lock boxes for parcels, or an extra guard. But I feel like if you're doing that, it's also good to always share that there are trade-offs whenever there are expenses or things, because the reality is you can make any condo in the GTA, whether it's downtown or in a rougher neighborhood, 100% secure. But there's a trade-off and there's a cost to that. And even a cost of a security guard or additional cameras. Let's suppose it's $60,000. For a large condo, that might be just 2% of their condo fees. But for a smaller condo, it could be anywhere from 5 to 10% of their condo fees. So, are they willing to see that increase? Certainly there might be creative options, and certainly you don't want to dismiss that owner's sense of safety. So definitely acknowledge what they're saying, take time to understand them a bit more, and certainly go back to the board and discuss possibilities, while letting that owner know that certainly there are trade-offs to certain options.
All right, thank you, Anthony. And just a few comments more from Tanya, perhaps.
Thanks. I like the trade-off comment that Anthony was making, because it's that trade-off of, do I feel secure or have I imprisoned myself? So it's that balance as well. Ultimately, anything is possible. if you want to pay for it. So the AGM is a good venue for people to bring this up, but without the expectation that a vote will be taken, because obviously the board has to take this to their own meeting. But owners should be made aware that I think there's a perception that there's a pot of gold at the end of the condo rainbow that can be accessed anytime, and things like installing new cameras can't be a reserve fund expense, because people see their reserve fund growing and think, wow, there's over $1 million there. We can do all these things. But that $1 million has been accounted for windows, roofs, cladding, everything else that happens in a condo. So not everything can be put in the reserve. And as I mentioned earlier, condo living is luxury living. If you don't have concierge or security and it's something you want to entertain, first of all, and I'll defer to Brad to make comments as well. Depends what your declaration says with respect to what services you can. You might need a vote of owners to change services in a condo. But let's say everything was kosher that way. You're probably looking at a minimum of $250,000 to get full-time security in a building. So if you have a building of 800 units, maybe not as big of a hit to the pocketbook as if you have 50 units. So that economy of scale really comes to play the costs. And to Anthony's point as well, being tolerant and empathetic of where this mindset is coming from if people feel unsafe in their homes. And I think that's something we always have to be mindful of. The AGM is a business meeting, but you're dealing with people's homes. And it's very personal. So it's taking the emotional aspect and then the running a business aspect and trying to bring it together in a nice cohesive package. And I know when the Vaughan shootings happened, it elicited panic in a lot of condos and for a lot of homeowners. Catalytic converters were being stolen from cars in garages. So there's always something that's happening, and we're always reacting to the latest juicy thing that we're talking about. So wherever there's a big news story or what have you, we don't focus on, there's thousands of condos that go without incident, but we focus on the crime stories that we hear, right? And that's what gets people riled up. But we don't want to necessarily elicit panic, but we want people to feel safe in their homes for sure. So hearing these things also gives, I feel, the board a pulse of what the community is feeling, and then helps guide them in their decision-making process.
All right, thank you so much for that. And we get into a topic that comes up maybe about 10% of the time, which is a request to ask the director candidates questions before the vote. So I'll take the first shot at responding on this one. Often when I'm the chairperson, I'm asking the candidates to introduce themselves. If they're running from the floor, I now have the routine of going through the disclosure questionnaire. And my preference, although the Condominium Act is totally silent on the matter, is that I will not allow questions after the candidates' introductions just before the vote. It literally does derail your meeting. It can be very time consuming, especially if you have 5 or 6 or even 7 candidates. If each one of those candidates were to answer 3 questions, it would easily take an hour, as this webinar can demonstrate. And so, you know, if owners are objecting to a lack of familiarity with the candidates, I would suggest that a separate candidate meet and greet be convened in advance of the next AGM as a workaround. The moments just before the vote should be free from interruption. You can have sort of pre-planned unfair comments, intimidation, denying owners the right to really vote freely. And I would also rely on the fact that we have these prescribed questions from the candidate disclosure questionnaire. And so what I would say you do, if you get a request to ask questions of the candidates, you'd say, well, the Condominium Act has prescribed questions. Here's what they are. And even if they were already included in the meeting package in writing, I would repeat them orally and just get each of the candidates to confirm that their answers are still correct and the same and nothing has changed. And I would leave it at that and then jump into the vote. That's how I would deal with that type of a question from the floor, so that you don't get derailed and you don't get into, you know, a 1-hour discussion just before you're about to do your vote. So, Amy, do you want to add to that?
Well, you and I kind of talked about this when we met. I've only seen it happen a couple times, and when I've seen it happen at meetings and in reading it in minutes, it's usually a new owner who's just getting clarity regarding a specific director. It wasn't questions that were asked to each director. So I guess it's difficult because you're kind of opening Pandora's box once you start accepting questions, and that's the issue. So again, this is when I speak, and I spoke with my team about this webinar, and from every single person, they said it's about the chair, the chair, the chair, and how the chair controls that meeting. That is critical. And so my team is very excited. I'm not promoting Brad per se, I'm promoting lawyers in sharing meetings. Not saying that a board director can't do it or a manager can't chair a meeting, but just like taking minutes, you need some training and some experience. There is a requirement of a chair to be very strong and organized and understand the flow of that meeting. The chair role is critical, critical.
All right, thank you. So let's jump into our next election-related question, which is how many votes did each candidate receive? So of course you are announcing the winners, and sometimes it's very close and someone is winning just by a single vote, which I've seen happen recently. We had one where we had like almost a tie, and then we had to recount, and candidate A was up by one vote, and we counted again, and then candidate B was up by one vote, and it was very stressful. And I did not understand how, after counting the same number of ballots and proxies 3 times, we got a tie, one person leading by one and one person leading by a different person leading by one, 3 different results. That was a little unnerving for me. That was an in-person meeting, of course, because that type of thing will happen more in person than it will virtually. So we get these questions: how many did each candidate receive? And then of course you have it the other way, which is someone got 200 votes and the other person got 2 themselves, and one person who voted for them by accident. So how would we respond to this type of question? Tania, what's your typical response?
I've seen it happen both ways, where the actual reports are provided. However, my thought is always to protect the candidates. So if they're open to it, fine. However, remembering that this is a volunteer position, people are putting themselves forward to be accepted by their fellow owners in this important role. We don't want to discourage anyone from running. So to your point, whether someone wins by 5 or 50 doesn't really matter. I know you gave an example of 1 by 1, and then every time you count it, it's a different number, and that's a different thing. And we've come where there's been a tie and we need to redo things, which is why I love the electronic process, because you're not handing out little chits of paper again and taking another hour for people to count them. But I would ask, what's the benefit of knowing what the actual numbers are? This is different than a political election. Candidates are volunteers who want to help. They're putting their name forward. Are we hurting their feelings or embarrassing someone in a situation? I find that this question typically comes up from 2 sources: a candidate that themselves doesn't get elected and they want to see how much they won or lost by, so they could challenge if it was 1 or 2 votes, maybe the count was incorrect. Or there's a group that their candidate didn't get elected, and they want to know the details of that. So this is why we love the virtual and online process. It's so much faster than back in the day when we had to leave the room and count 200 little pieces of paper and hope it's done correctly. But we do. People need to consider, the owners that are at the meeting, that there are scrutineers, whether it's virtual or in person. There are people that go and count the ballots, they validate the process. The chairperson's there to oversee it too, if there's any question with respect to that. So we need to trust the process a little bit, but I understand that loss of trust can be huge in some condos, and they just want to know what the election results are. And I'd say you need to be mindful of the consequence of doing that. However, if the candidates are all fine with it, I don't see a problem with doing that. I just think the condo may run into future problems where you might have a hard time getting good candidates coming forward because they don't want to know the election results.
All right. And Amy, what's your perspective on announcing the results?
Oh, is that something I was supposed to answer?
I can cover for you if you want. I've got
No, I was just going to speak though to Tania about when she spoke to trust, and I think that overall is a big item that can derail the AGM. And what increases that trust is communication. And we are noticing that in terms of duration as well of an AGM, if you're having a town hall or a general owners meeting throughout the year, that's really going to contribute to a smoother running AGM, keeping that communication open with the owners. Another item that we notice is board reports, president's reports, treasurer's reports, is including that within your AGM package will really allow owners to digest that information, take that in ahead of time, and it will help reduce some of those angry questions, that lack of knowledge. So we're seeing that more and more where boards are being a little more organized and having formal reports included in the AGM package. And we really recommend that. So sorry, I've kind of gone off topic, but I wanted to make sure I did that. But how many votes did each candidate receive? I don't really think that's a requirement. What I've seen happen in the past is if they want those votes, they can come to the management office afterwards and go through that, but it doesn't need to be announced at the meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So I'll tag on my perspective on it is if a candidate wants to know, especially an unsuccessful candidate wants to know how many votes they received, that candidate will always be able to get that information from me as the chairperson. I will provide it to them either during the meeting or in a private message or after the meeting in a private email. In terms of announcing the results publicly, I generally don't do it unless all of the candidates consent. And I consider it, just as Tania was saying, the right to know versus the candidates, not wanting to discourage people. And just, I think it's a nice thing to do to say to the candidates, hey, does anyone have an objection to me announcing this? It's not secret, but it's not public either. And usually the candidates will say, no, we don't mind. And then I can announce the results in that way. And that's just a nice way to cover off the concern about not wanting to discourage people. So that's the sort of sensitive approach there. And we get on to our last question. We had a couple backup questions prepared in case we were running ahead of time, but we are not. Is can we vote on X? X being something that would, change the governing documents or change the composition of the board, but is not on the agenda. And to this question, I would always answer and have at my fingertips, well, I wish we could, but section 47 sub 8 of the Condo Act doesn't allow it. It says, quite literally, no vote shall be taken at a meeting of owners on any matter other than routine procedure unless that matter was clearly disclosed in the notice of meeting. So we're limited to what's in the notice of meeting, and a plain language explanation of that is the owners who aren't here today didn't know that we were going to vote on that, whether that is to use an innocuous example, expand the board from 3 members to 5, right? And had they known, because they had received notice in the 15-day notice of meeting package, they might have chosen to attend. But because it was only going to be the election of one director, they said, I don't need to vote on that. And they chose not to be here. And we need to protect the rights of the owners who are not here. And so someone asked, about putting things getting submissions in the preliminary notice, and we can talk about that maybe in the Q&A if we have a moment. But yes, there are some times when you send out your preliminary notice and items can get added to the agenda through the submission process delivered to the condo before the 15-day notice of meeting goes out, and then it will be on your agenda and you can vote on it. But short of that process, no. And Tanya, anything to add to that?
I think you summed it up. Short answer is no. But
Yeah.
but with that, if people do bring things up, it's an opportunity for the board to say they'll consider it at a future board meeting as well, not something they can vote on depending on what it is. And to your point, the preliminary notice offers people an opportunity to add things to the agenda afterwards. But I think also the owners need to be reminded that there's limitations to what owners are responsible to vote for. And we do want them to come and to participate in a meeting, because you can't complain about board members if you didn't come vote at the election. And it's one thing as a manager, I used to really love when someone didn't come to an AGM and then came to my office to complain about stuff. Were you at the AGM? No. Goodbye. So I think it's opportunity to remind the owners they're electing board members to make operational decisions on their behalf. Their burden is to elect the right people to make those decisions. And that's sort of where those decision-making processes start and stop. But again, it's sometimes it is only once a year. To Amy's point, if you're not having town hall meetings, maybe your communication is poor, which is why you're having difficult AGMs, but it gives you a pulse of what people are feeling, because if they're passionate enough to come show up, whether it's virtual or in person, it's important for them to at least be heard, and then the board can follow up on whether they're going to pursue it or not. But it does always come up, because when you see new business or other business on an agenda, people feel like they can bring up motions to be voted for, and that's really not what that is. It's more like a Q&A period at the end, or some feedback opportunity.
Thank you. Okay, so that takes us to the end of our 8 prepared questions. We're going to try and take some questions from the floor, some other business, if you will. And it's so bad.
I laugh, Brad.
Oh, thank you. And so we got a question in the chat. Can Brad please repeat the Condo Act section number again? Sure. It's 47 sub 8. 47 sub 8. If you go onto the Google and you type Condominium Act 1998 and you pull it up on e-laws, 47 sub 8 says no vote shall be taken at a meeting of owners on any matter other than routine procedure unless clearly disclosed in the notice of meeting. So that's where you'll find that. And then we have a similar question that came up early in our section from Ada. She says, people at AGM cannot bring up other items, ? Well, other business, of course. Can they do so if they prior submit those issues at the preliminary notice of meeting? So this is the submission, right? We were talking about this before, which is the 35-day notice of meeting includes in the preliminary notice that owners have the right to submit items to be added to the agenda or added to the meeting package, such as documents. The board can add them upon receipt, provided that they get it in time. And if it's accompanied by the signatures of the owners of at least 15% of the units, then they're required to add it to the agenda or to the meeting package if it's a document. Of course, subject to Tanya's point, which is that it has to be something that is actually subject to a vote of owners. So for example, a classic item that is not subject to a vote of owners is vote to remove the lawyer or manager or landscaper or meeting host company or minute taker or any of us. That is up to the board. So thank you, Ada, for that. Do we want to go to hands up, Anthony, or do you want to look at some of the written Q&A? I'll defer to you.
I also, yeah, I mean, I also noticed that it is 12 o'clock and we did only schedule an hour. I'm happy to stay an extra 10 minutes if the other panelists are willing to do so as well. But yeah, I guess
Sure.
it looks like everyone is okay with doing that, but we certainly understand that some property managers here may be unable to do that. So if you're unable to stay, feel free to log off. We're happy that you attended, and yeah, we can certainly go through some of the raise of hands. So I do see a raise of hand from Andrew Fong. So Andrew, I've unmuted your microphone if you'd like to verbally ask a question. Maybe not. Okay, and I do see a hand raised from Ada Ruza in case you had a question. Nope. Nope. Okay,
Yeah,
but Christine Dade did raise her hand. So Christine, did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm muted now.
Yeah, go ahead. You're unmuted.
Okay, okay, great. I was wondering, is it a good idea to have some of the issues addressed in the president's message to sort of just let people know different things, that what might come up or whatever? Do you think it's a good idea to do that and to be more informative to the owners of the condos?
Do you want me to speak to that, Anthony? Because
Go ahead.
yeah, I kind of spoke to that, Christine, when I was speaking about including in the AGM package. Most times on an agenda, there is a presentation from the board, whether it be a board report, a president's report, a treasurer's report, or all of the above, is to have that included in the AGM package so that residents can read that ahead of time and digest it and think about it. So they're not coming in all hot and heavy. Some of what's in that report may answer a lot of questions and clarify things for them. And it just helps with transparency and communication.
I would agree to add to that. It's always helpful, keeping in mind that the AGM, it's for the owners. And the board was elected by the owners to do certain things. So it's nice when the board can either attach a report in advance, which it was ideal, or at least read a report at the AGM that can get incorporated into the minutes. Sometimes we see when that happens, it turns into a Q&A period, and I would say defer that part until your other business section. But the more information people have, the less opportunity it is for them to fill in the blanks with whatever they think is going on. And again, it's only once a year that we're required to have these meetings. So if this is the only communication residents are getting, that board report is key.
Anthony, can I ask you to take on the Q&A duties? I'm furiously typing answers to people who have legal questions in the Q&A right now.
All right.
Trying to answer
Right.
as many as I can.
It's great to have a legal resource in this webinar because there were certainly some legal questions in there. Great. So we have a question from John Recker. And this might be a legal question, so I'll hold off on that one. Let's work with the best shouldn't question. Okay, so Warren Reed. Warren, hi Warren. Shouldn't a question about maintenance fees be dealt with separately, not during an AGM? Tania, I wonder if you have any opinion about that one?
Sure. I agree it's not necessarily AGM topic, but people get, as I mentioned earlier, when the auditor is presenting a financial report, people lump that in with the budget as opposed to a report on the prior fiscal year. So if people are curious and it's a short answer, I'd say I would allow it because it's a genuine question, or take it offline and have the manager send them a copy of the budget, which hopefully has some detailed notes that can help them. But if one person's asking, there's probably more than one that are curious to whatever the answer is.
Yeah, I think so too. So Harmanjot Kaur, hi Harmanjot, writes, can we please have a recording of the session? So yeah, there will be a recording of the session afterwards. And as mentioned, we will be sending out a certificate of completion by tomorrow for all attendees at this meeting. Ada writes, who decides whether an AGM should be held in person or virtually? Is it not the board that's supposed to make this decision? Now, Tania, I know you've been in many board meetings, so maybe you have some opinion on this.
Yeah, ultimately, it is the board's decision. Back when the world shut down in 2020, we were furiously making bylaws to allow the electronic, and then now it's become legislation. So I'm sure Brad has some comment
Yeah.
on it too. But it's ultimately, despite our preference, it's ultimately the board's discretion.
Yeah, same idea here. It's a board decision whether the meeting is virtual or in person. And at one point in time, it looked as though you were going to require a bylaw in order to be able to have in person or virtual meetings. And then as those deadlines kept hitting, the amendments to the Condominium Act done under emergency law were extended and extended. And then finally, it was made permanent. And I'll just note that that was not just for condominium corporations. The same changes were implemented for other kinds of co-ops and not-for-profits and charitable organizations. So this was something done across the board in Ontario to allow virtual meetings to take place.
Great. And I'm just looking for more questions. There's a lot of thank you messages in here from people that were dropping off. So a question from Wayne Arthurs. Wayne writes, I've found a number of owners tend to focus on their own problems and not general business related to the common elements. Do you have a way of dealing with this? So Brad, I know you've chaired many meetings. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, so, okay, I'm of two minds. If the question can be answered with a 5-second response, I just give that response because it's just a practical approach to the problem. You know, someone says, well, what do I, where do I go to reserve an elevator? Or that, I mean, that would actually be fine. But if it's something specific to their unit, I'm having a leak, instead of saying, well, sir, this is the wrong time to tell us that you're having a leak, I'll just say, okay, great. What unit number? We'll get back to you, and then, but the technical answer to that is something to the effect of, this is other business. Other business is to speak to the affairs of the corporation. That means matters that affect all owners. For anything pertaining to your unit, you can bring that up with the management office anytime offline before or after the meeting, but not during this precise moment of the AGM. Most people are understanding. And we just use our discretion as to when we provide that sort of canned answer and when we just try to help them out.
Great. And we're approaching 12:10, so we'll take one final question. This one comes from Rita Amato. Rita writes, I'm adding cameras from the operating fund. I guess she meant if adding cameras from the operating fund, this requires notice to owners. What would be the cost of the project, which depends on notifying the owners? Is there a minimum or does it depend on the declarations? It's more legal, so I think Brad's getting ready to answer this one.
I know the answer. Okay, this is a very common question. It's you're going to look at Section 97 of the Condominium Act. Section 97 of the Condominium Act is going to tell you that if the total cost of your project is greater than 1% of your budget or $1,000, whichever is larger, then you are going to give a 30-day notice to owners. It's the same kind of notice that you give for passing a rule. And then you can get a requisition for a vote of owners within that 30 days. If no requisition after 30 days, then you can proceed with the project. If the cost of the project is greater than 10%, 10% of your budget, then it's by definition a substantial change and it requires a meeting of owners and a 2/3 majority vote. Boo, those are really hard to pass. So most condos will design their security projects to be under that 10% threshold. They'll give the 30-day notice to owners. Very rarely will you get an objection, and then off you go.
Great. So yeah, that's the final question. And I know we did go a bit over time, so I appreciate the property managers that did stick around to listen to us answering a few more questions. There were 530 property managers that took time out of their morning to come to this webinar. So we want to thank all of them. And there were 430 that even stuck around for the extra 10 minutes. So we know you're all super busy all the time. So we really, really appreciate it. I want to thank Brad. I want to thank Tanya. I want to thank Amy once again for being our esteemed panelist at this webinar. And again, thank you everyone and have a great day.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank
Thank you to
you.
everyone who attended. That was great.
Bye, everyone.